Okay guys, tonight we begin with something complex. If not slightly pungent, the medieval inn, this was where tired travelers met suspicious stew, where ale flowed freely and so did lice, and where half your night was spent wondering whether that groan. Upstairs was someone snoring or dying, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining. Youths from around the world now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's not so much that the innkeeper wakes up, it's that he is awakened by the gentle sound of someone sneezing directly onto the floorboards below his room, followed by a groan, a crash, and the unmistakable blader of a chicken escaping through the front door again. He opens one eye, it's still dark out, which means it's either too early or too late. There's no between in medieval timekeeping. He sits up slowly as if peeling himself a loaf of bread and rubs the sleep from his face with a sleeve that once resembled linen but now has the texture of a worn saddlebag. His bed isn't bad, just simple straw mattress, slightly slanted with a blanket that smells faintly of garlic and must. Tuesday's ala cozy in the way a slightly damp cloak is cozy if you don't ask too many questions she dresses in. Stages first the tunic, then the trousers, then the belt, if I can find it after a brief search. He locates it hanging on a peg behind the door along with a spoon, a candle nub, and someone's sock. He doesn't ask who's asking questions before sunrise. Is a mistake downstairs, the common room is quiet unnervingly, so there are signs of life, a tipped mug, a boutonniere. The hearth, a man snoring under a table with the confidence of someone who's done this before. The innkeeper steps carefully around him. Waking guests too early often leads to awkward sword point discussion stokes. The hearth with a practiced flick of the poker, the goal is warmth, not a roaring blaze. Firewood is expensive, and the last time he got a real blaze going someone tried to cook a goose on it indoors with feathers still on, as he sets a pot over the flames ready to reheat. Whatever last night's stew has evolved into, he hears the distant bray of a mule, and the clump of early travelers arriving. He exhales. The inn isn't glamorous, but it's warm, it's busy, and most importantly, itches, and just like that, the day begins again. Breakfast at the inn is less of a meal and more of a negotiation between what's edible and what's legally defensible. The innkeeper ladles a thick scoop of something into a pot over the hearth. It doesn't have a name, but it does have a smell somewhere between boiled oats and a wet boot that's been thinking about cabbage. This is pottage, a medieval staple, not a recipe so much as a concept. Yesterday's pottage was made with barley and turnips. Today's includes those same turnips, now softer, and some mysterious bits from a goose that failed to escape last night. Add water, heat. Repeat. It's like soup. If soup gave up halfway, the bread is present hard as a roof tile and just as chewable. It's cut with care, mostly because the innkeeper doesn't want to break another knife on it. Guests chew it slowly, partly for digestion, partly because there's time to reflect on their life choices between bites. And the ale, oh yes, breakfast beer, it's not a medieval cliche, it's a necessity. The water here is questionable. Milk is reserved for the Lord's barn cat, and tea is still a twinkle in some fair-off merchant's eye. The ale is weak, but at least it's been boiled and filtered through sheer desperation. Even the children drink it with supervision, of course. This is a reputable establishment after all. By now guests are drifting in one by one, a merchant with a coin purse clutched like a holy relic, a sleepy Pilgrims still clutching his walking stick and muttering about blisters, and inevitable life bard who requests honey for his porridge as though honey hasn't been locked in a chest for weeks. The barmaid, agile and immune to nonsense, moves between tables. Like a dancer who's had enough, she smiles at the patrons, refills mugs, and dodges all-sided compliments with the grace of someone who has memorized every possible bad poem a drunk traveler can recite by the end of breakfast. The inn smells like smoked barley and ambition. Empty bowls clatter onto tables. Stomachs are foolish, spirits are lukewarm. It's not fine dining, but it's hot, it's filling, and nobody's died yet, which by medieval standards is a triumph. If there's one thing a medieval inn doesn't need more of its peopleite, by mid-morning, they begin to pour in like pigeons with luggage, and a booth same. Regard for personal hygiene first through the door is a knight, or rather someone claiming to be knight. He has armor, yes, but it's mismatched, rusty, and held together with what looks like curtain rope. He demands a private room. Despite having no coin, no manners, and the general son of a horse that lost a bet behind him is Amerchant's apprentice who talks like he owns a fleet of ships but pays with buttons. He tries to haggle over a bowl of soup as though this establishment offers Groupon deals. Then comes the Bardeverian. Has one he never actually pays, but insists that his songs are worth more than gold they aren't. He carries a lute, 6 strings missing, and immediately inches into a mournful tune about lost love and goat theft. Nobody asks for this. A monk shuffles in next. Nodding solemnly at everyone and blessing the furniture, he insists on fasting loudly while eyeing the bread within 10 minutes. He's eating said bread and explaining that technically it's not a sin. If the loaf was already broken by noon, the inn is full of clashing personalities and overlapping smells. Someone is drying their socks near the hearth, someone else is sharpening a knife for no clear reason. A child runs between tables pursed by a goose with a grudge in the corner. 2 travelers argue over who gets the only stool without a wobble, and overseeing it all is the Innkeeper, calm as a monk on payday. He's seen it all before. He knows that by evening someone will fall in love, someone will fall asleep in their soup, and someone will challenge a stool to a duel probably. The bard again, he pours another mug, wipes the counter with a cloth that has seen better centuries, and gives a nod to the barmaid. A silent agreement that despite everything, this place is still running. The guests may be unpredictable, loud occasionally, bleeding, but they're also what makes the inn, and he wouldn't have it any other way, except quieter and with fewer goose chases. If the inn has a soul, or at least a functioning brain, it's the barmaid. Her name is Marjorie. She's about 20, possibly 30, or maybe she just aged rapidly from exposure. To traveling poets, no one knows for sure. What people do know is that the entire operation would collapse into a stew. Soaked heap, without her, she moves through all the chaos with practiced precision, one hand balancing a tray of mugs, the other swatting a wandering hand that misjudged her patience. Her reflexes are faster than a ferret in a pantry. A drunken mercenary once tried to compliment her ankles and woke up 2 days later with his boots nailed to the ceiling. Marjorie can take an order in 4 dialects, pour ale without spilling a drop, and insult a noble without technically committing treason. She's not rude. She's efficient and in a building held together by splinters and half promises. She is the only one with actual authority. She knows which travelers will pay in coin and which will try to barter with seashells. She can sniff out a fake agent, a stolen ring, and a flirt disguised as a food complaint. The monk may mumble about sin, but even he knows Marjorie is the patron saint of keeping things moving. Her day starts before dawn and ends long after the fire burns low. In that time she serves stew chase. Children bandage a scraped knee and somehow find time to refill every mug in the room, often while dodging falling cutlery or calming down an argument about who owns the goat that wandered in during lunch. And yet she never drops the tray. That's the magic of it. Marjorie doesn't run the inn on paper, but in practice it's her kingdom. The innkeeper might own the walls, but she controls Theffler. A wink here, a sharp word there, a stare that can curdle milk. It's a delicate dance, and she performs it daily with a kind of grace that only comes from years of low expectations and high tolerance. Lunch at a medieval inn isn't so much a meal as it is a test of coordination, patience, and one's tolerance for noise that registers somewhere between festival and siege. It begins innocently enough. The hearth is warm, the stew is bubbling, and Marjorie rings the battered iron triangle That signals food is ready, a peaceful moment, brief, immediately followed by stampede-level chaos guests emerge from corners. You didn't know existed. A trader leaps over a sleeping dog. A bard swings his lute over one's holder like he's marching into battle. Two farmers argue over who sat down first, despite there being 6 empty benches and absolutely no one keeping score. The innkeeper ladles out steaming bowls of pottage, a dish whose exact ingredients are known only to the pot and possibly divine beings. It's hearty worm and completely flavorless, unless you count turnip as a flavor, one guest asks. If it's vegetarian, another asks. What vegetarian means, the innkeeper pretends he doesn't hear either of them. Bread is handed out with the ceremonial dunk of something recently used as a durs. Stop diners attempt to dip it in their stew to soften it, resulting in several casualties to the bottoms of bowls. One man tries to trade his crust for a second helping of ale. It works. Marjorie weaves through the chaos, her tray loaded with mugs and her eyes locked in that thousand-wise stare known only to battlefield nurses and women who've had to break up 2 arguments about seating etiquette before noon. She dole out food, smiles, and issues warnings all at once. A one-woman performance that deserves a round of applause, but will settle for a full tip jar somewhere near Hearth. A pair of guards is trying to outburp each other while a suspiciously cheerful monk hums a hymn between mouthfuls. The goat has returned again. It seems to enjoy the company. Lunch lasts about an hour at least, according to the sun time inside. The inn is measured by how long it takes for someone to spill on themselves, accuse someone else of cheating at dice, or attempt to sing with a mouthful of onion, and when it's over there's silence, brief, eerie, until someone drops a spoon and it all begins again. Lunch is over, the stew has been consumed, the bread has been gnawed, the goat has once again been escorted out with stern words, and a broom now begins. Part of the day, innkeepers dread most cleaning up after the guests who swore they were very tidy to the untrained eye may look like a normal dining room in mild disarray, but to Marjorie and the innkeeper, it's a full-blown archaeological dig site, complete with mysterious stains, lost personal items, and a deeply unsettling amount of onion peels in places. Onions should never have been through wooden tables or wiped down with a cloth. That much like the innkeeper has seen too much, it doesn't clean. So mooches smear everything into a nice medieval glaze. The floors are swept, mostly by pushing things under benches and hoping gravity takes care of the rest. A boot is discovered under one of the stools. No one claims it. It's at a tough growing pile behind the bar, labeled possibly belongs to someone. Marjorie starts collecting dishes with the speed and precision of someone who's done this every day for a decade and would very much like to stop guests who linger too long, get the look, a glance. So potent Itons made a noble apologize and tip an entire silver coin. He was never seen again, but the story remains legend. The soup pot is scraped clean. Whatever remains is either fed to the pigs or quietly reincorporated into tomorrow's recipe. Waste not, want, not especially he. Nobody can tell the difference after the 3rd bowl. The innkeeper mutters something about washing the mugs, but everyone knows he'll just rinse them in the rain barrel and call it divine purification. There is a bucket for soaking, but it's mostly ceremonial at this point, as the final crumbs are brushed away and the benches are set back in place. Somehow always wobblier than before the room starts to resemble an inn again, rather than the scene of particularly well-fed right. Marjorie takes a breath, straightens her apron, and prepares for the next wave, because in a medieval inn, peace is never permanent. It's just the brief pause between one mess and the next, and somewhere someone is already asking when supper will be ready. Just as the last bowl is stacked, the last spoon dried isn't. Marjorie dares to take a sip of leftover ale in peace. It happens, the door cracks open, new guests, fresh faces, fresh problems, and worst of all, question Shay. First traveler steps, and wearing an oversized cloak, a beard that could house several woodland creatures, and an expression that suggests he's about to review the place on parchment. He walks up to the bar and asks, "Do you serve ale and milk?" The silence is immediate and total. Somewhere in the corner, a stool cacks under the weight of collective judgment behind him arrives. A young couple, clearly not married, based on how closely they're standing and how determined they are not to touch, who ask if they can see the room first. Marjorie simply points upstairs. It's wooden, it has walls, it doesn't leak in summer. Usually a third guest, covered in dust and self-importance, insists on knowing where the inn sources its candles, whether the stew is ethically prepared, and if the goat has been trained to stay outside. The goat, of course, enters at that exact moment and promptly sneezes on his boots. Then there's the bard, a different bard this time, who insists on paying with a song. He plucks his lute, it's 3 wrong notes in a row, and launches into a ballad about the lady in the leaky chamber pot. He is immediate lias to stop politely with a broom. The innkeeper nods his way through every request, every complaint, and every mispronounced question about wine. Varieties, there's one wine and it's reddish. He doesn't argue, he doesn't correct, he simply listens, smiles, and lets Marjorie handle it, because if there's one thing that fills an inn faster than rain, it's travelers with opinions, and they never arrive. Quietly by sundown, the common room is a patchwork of personalities. The quiet scribe in the corner, the arguing merchants near the fire, the bard on Hissicand, attempt at winning affection through volume, and the goat now asleep under table 3, the innkeeper, ex-lesson of their batch of guests, another round of small disasters waiting to unfold, and all of them somehow think they're the normal ones. Supper time arrives, not with elegance, but with noise loud. Overlapping noise, chairs scrape, mugs clink. Someone coughs theatrically to hint that they've been waiting ages, even though they arrived 9 minutes ago and are still wearing their traveling cloak. Like it's a crown, Marjorie emerges from the kitchen holding a pot that's technically still warm. And definitely still stew. The day's menu hasn't changed. It's still the inn signature dish, whatever was left from earlier, slightly reheated. It's served with a chunk of bread that could double as a blunt weapon and a side of commentary from the guests. This stew tastes different than last night. One traveler says with suspicion, "It's the same stew, Marjorie, please," without looking up. Oh, well, it's nice they act quickly now. Fearing for their cutlery privileges, the bard, who is still Hersamehau, offers to perform a song in honor of the meal. He gets through one verse before Marjorie places a ladle in his bowl with a little more enthusiasm than necessary. He gets the message over near the hearth. 2 merchants are having a lively debate about grain prices, which is somehow louder than the Kupler gang about how many fleas they counted on the bed upstairs. The goat has returned. It is now under the table, a game bang, quietly fed by a child who insists it's his emotional livestock. The stew is filling, the ale flows freely, which helps with how filling the stew is, and despite the occasional complaint about texture, temperament, or the existential ambiguity of the meat, everyone eats. The innkeeper stands behind the counter, polishing a mug that hasn't been truly clean since last harvest. Watching his patrons with the expression of a man woe has accepted his fate, he knows that in about an hour someone will spill something, someone else will fall asleep mid-sentence, and the bard will try again. Always tries again, but for now, the room is loud, messy, and very much alive, which is, if nothing else, a sign of success, because in a medieval inn, supper doesn't need to be good. Just needs to arrive without catching fire, as the last spoon clinks against the bottom of a bowl, and guests begin to lean back with the satisfied groans of people who served another round of stew. The real show begins. Evening entertainment loosely defined. There is no scheduled program, no flyers, no host with a lute in the schedule. The evening simply unfolds the way all great performances do, with no structure, limited talent, and a strong chance of mild injury. The bard, of course, seizes the moment. He clears his throat, dramatically plucks 3 uncertain strings, and announces a ballad titled "The Fair Lady of Festerwell, who married a troll." Half the room cheers, the other half groans. The goat sneezes, his voice eyes enthusiastic. The lyrics rhyme. Occasionally, the innkeeper pours himself a mug of ale and drinks deeply the way Aemon does when he knows. There are still 6 verses to go, and at least one of them will involve sock theft, meanwhile at the far table. 2 old friends are trying to best each other in a slurred riddle contest. The rules are unclear onif. The riddles might actually be a recipe. A nearby monk politely covers his ears and starts humming psalms at a volume typically reserved for church bells. The dice come out next wooden chipped and possibly bless your cursed opinions. Various small crowd gathers aspects are made using. Coins buttons a very old pair and one man's left. Shoo, nobody questions it. The pair's value is disputed. Marjorie circles the room. Like a falcon with excellent hearing, she's watching for trouble spilled, and Inionwo looks like they're about to stand on a table. She catches the bard mid-step, just as he tries to perform a dramaturgische on a bench leg. That clearly wasn't designed for theater. In the corner, a shy traveler shilly produces a flute. It produces 3 lovely notes before the goat headbutts him. Applause all around. Evening entertainment at the inn isn't polished, rehearsed, or even entirely legal in some towns, but it's real, it's loud, and it almost always ends with someone snoring into their mug or waking up with a new tattoo. Drawn in soot, there is no official closing time at the inn. There's no bell, no lights out announcement, and certainly no polite usher guiding guests toward the door. No closing time is more of a gradual societal collapse. It begins when the bard finally loses his audience. This usually happens when he forgets the lyrics to the final verse and replaces them with dramatic throat noises. Someone throws a crust of bread in appreciation. It's unclear whether it's applause or a bribe to stop next a few. Patrons start to slump, not from ale necessarily, but from sheer caloric weight. The stew is settled. Gravity has one merchant leans so far back on his stool that he becomes furniture. His companion uses him as a footrest. Marjorie starts stacking empty mugs like she's building a small fortress. She doesn't say much, just raises one eyebrow, which in the language of innkeeping means wrap it up or start sweeping. There's always one guest who insists on ordering something after the hearth has gone dark tonight. It's a peddler who thinks a light snack means a full roast duck. He is given bread a look and a firm suggestion to chew slowly and sleep sooner. The goat, ever present, has curled up by the embers. It is technically not allowed indoors, but at this point it's paid more attention during story hour than half the humans, so exceptions are made. The innkeeper begins his rounds. He pokes at the dying fire, checks that no one has passed out face down in the stew pot again, and gently nudges a snoring traveler off a table and onto a bench. A professional move learned through years of subtle repositioning. One couple heads upstairs, bumping into every visible surface. They will by morning complain about the noise. The irony is noted and filed away for later passive-aggressive aimment. Eventually, the room empties, not all at once, but in soft wobbly waves like a tide of cloaks yawns, and the occasional hiccup. The chatter fades. The laughter dies down. The inn grows quiet. Sort of a mug rolls off a table. Someone upstairs drops a boot. The goat sigh deeply, but for now, the worst of the day is over. The guests are asleep, or at least horizontal, and no longer speaking. Climbing the stairs in a medieval inn is an act of faith, not spiritual faith, structural. The steps creak, groan, and occasionally shift underfoot like they're considering early retirement, but for the weary traveler upstairs means one thing: a place to collapse. The rooms vary. Some are private if you're wealthy or convincingly loud about it. Most, however, are shared dormitory style arrangements where strangers sleep mere inches apart and everyone pretends not to hear anything. The beds are wooden frames stuffed with straw and dreams. Blankets, if you're lucky, pillow-simile if you brought your own or creatively folded your cloak. And yes, the straw rustles constantly, sometimes because it's dry, sometimes because something inside it is also trying to sleep. Snoring is inevitable. Someone always starts with edmonds of lying down, not light, adorable snoring. We're talking medieval. Snoring the kind that echoes off wooden beams and makes you question if there's a wild boar in the rafters. One guest tosses in his sleep another. One hums a hymn through his nose, which is deeply unsettling. Privacy as a concept does not exist. You can pull your cloak over your head, but that only muffles the sounds of someone in the next bed loudly discussing dreams involving fish and taxes. Someone else keeps getting up to check on the stew, which is just code for needing the chamber pot. Located discreetly behind a curtain that fools no one, speaking of which, yes. The chamber pot, it's there, it's full, it's everyone's problem. It's also someone's footrest until they realize their mistake too. Late occasionally, someone stumbles in after. Dark unsure of which bed is theirs and prepared to argue about it, arguments are brief, muffled by exhaustion, and typically settled by whoever has the larger boots or stronger odor, and yet despite the noises, the smells, the suspicious straw, and the shared air, there's something oddly comforting about it. A dozen people, all from different places, sleeping under the same crooked beams, snoring in harmony upstairs, isn't peaceful, but it's safe, warmish, and with luck mostly free of goats, which at this hour of night counts as luxury. Its latte de fire has burned down to glowing embers. The common room is finally still, except for the occasional creak, the kind that makes you wonder if the building is settling or if something alive is navigating. The beams either way, it's time for the Innkeeper's midnight patrol. This ritual isn't written anywhere, but every innkeeper knows it. It involves a candlelight, an exhausted sigh, and a silent prayer that no one has died, started a fire, or sleepwalked into. The pantry again, the tour begins downstairs. The benches are mostly empty. The mugs are half drunk, half spilled, and possibly fermenting into something new. A spoon floats in the ale barrel. The innkeeper doesn't want to know how or why he checks the doors front and back, both bolted. Probably, maybe the front one tends to swing open during high winds. Or emotional conversations, he props a bucket in front of it just in case. Behind the counter, he counts the coins from the day's trade. Most of it is real currency, some of it is buttons, carved bones, and once it gained that same old pair, he places it in the undecided value. Bull next up upstairs tiptoes like a man sneaking through a nest of mildly drunk wolves. Each floorboard betrays him with a creak louder than the last. Behind one door, someone snores with conviction behind another. Someone mumbles about taxes in their sleep. He peeks into the shared room, a sea of limbs and cloaks. One guestess, sleeping upside down, another has tucked themselves under the bed like a human storage box. The chamber pot is full as always, then comes the weird part of the patrol, things that shouldn't be moving. A broom has fallen over again. The candle flickers despite no draft. He hears the unmistakable sound of a lute string being plucked, even though the bard went to bed 2 hours ago, or was Tito. The wagon outside, depends who you ask, and of course the goat is missing. Again, the innkeeper exhales, everything is by this end standards fine. He descends the stairs, blows out the candle, and mutters, "If anything catches fire, let it the bad stew." It's the middle of the night, and technically everyone is asleep, but let's not pretend it's restful. The shared upstairs room hums like a beehive of human discomfort. Snoring is the dominant sound, layered, textured, and deeply unmusical. Lone guest snores in short bursts like a hiccuping squirrel. Another goes for volume, vibrating the rafters with every exhale. It's like a symphony of sleep apnea. Someone talks in their sleep, mostly about carrots. Another keeps whispering, "No, my lord," in a tone that suggests either a bad dream or romantic misunderstanding. A boot falls with a thud onto the floor. Nobody moves, not even the goat, now snuggled beneath Simeon's cloak like it owns the place. The bed frames creak in protest every time someone rolls over, which happens often, as straw mattresses are not known for their ergonomic support. In fact, I fear not stabbed by a twig in the first 5 minutes. The bed is probably haunted. Then there's the heat with so many bodies in one room. The temperature climbs to barn. In summer cloaks, our shed blankets kicked, and someone decides to open the shuttered Window immediately letting in a breeze, and the local owl now refuses to leave the smell. It's what one might politely call robust. A fragrant blend of stewed digestion, unwashed socks, warm goat, and the vague ghost of ale. It would be unbearable if everyone weren't already too tired to curry. Occasionally, someone wakes up convinced it's morning. It's not, it's just darker than before. And now, there's an owl watching. They stumble out of bed, step on someone's hand, and are shushed back into place with a grunt. Marjorie sleeps in the back room errand to pick up anything alarming, raised voices, sudden crashes, or loop music after. Hours so far, so good, Mosleyan. Downstairs, the innkeeper snoozes behind the bar in a chair shaped exactly like his spine. He holds a mug he didn't finish. He dreams of silence. He will not get it because in a medieval inn, sleep comes in short shifts. Shared spaces and suspicious warmth, but still everyone shares it all. That's considered victory at the first hint of light, that faint murky gray, that could be dawn, or just an optimistic moon. The inn begins to stern it gracefully, more like a barn full of animals that have realized someone forgot to lock the door. Feet hit the floor with varying degrees of commitment. Someone groans dramatically as if waking up was unexpected and entirely unfair. Another guest immediately begins searching for their missing boot. It's on Hearth. No one knows how the goat does, but he's noddling. The shared room empties in waves. The early risers, merchants, monks, and Danion with a guilty conscience creep out first. They leave behind a mess of wrinkled blankets, muddy footprints, and one still sleeping traveler who insists even in dreams that he didn't touch the cheese downstairs. The innkeeper is already awake. Technically, his eyes are open. His body is upright, but his soul is still halfway between this world and wherever old barkeepers go in their dreams. Somewhere with clean mugs and quiet guests, Marjorie arrives moments later, wrapped in a shawl and sheer determination. She begins her silent inventory of overnight damage. 2 overturned stools and missing candle, and someone inexplicably put jam on the broom handle. Questions start immediately. Has anyone seen my satchel? Did I pay last night? Is this my goat? To each, Marjorie offers the same response, a slow blink, followed by a flat maybe. Then comes the denials. I didn't spill that ale. I wasn't the one snoring. I never said that about the monk's sandals. Everyone denies everything loudly, even when confronted with direct evidence, like a ladle stuck in someone's belt or a half-eaten turnip in their boot. The bard reappears blurried and declaring he has written a new verse about the night's events. He is promptly offered a bowl of porridge and told to eat quietly. For once he complies. Breakfast is served, stew is reheated, ale is poured, life continues. By the time the sun fully rises, most guests have either paid or bartered their way out. Some leave sheepishly, others stride off proudly convinced they were charming, but one truth remains: nobody ever admits what happened after supper. The guests have trickled out. The goat has been escorted again, and Marjorie is scraping something unidentifiable off a bench with the focus of a surgeon and the face of a woman reconsidering every life choice that led her here. The common room is quiet now, not peaceful, just taking a breath. A few embers crackle in the hearth. The floor is sticky. One bench list slightly to the left, either from masseuse or protest. The innkeeper stands bent, the counter cradling a mug of the morning's first ale. Like it's a family heirloom, he gazes across the room and mutters the same thing he mutters every morning. Well, that wasn't too bad. It was, of course, but optimism helps digestion. Marjorie walks past with a tray of used spoons, a frayed cloth, and the look of someone who will not be answering questions before sunrise tomorrow. She refills the stew pot with water, salt, and faith, and begins stirring. Breakfast will happen, as always, outside. A cart rattles by. A rooster announces its existence. Somewhere in the village, a smith hammers something unreasonably loud for this hour, and just like that, the world is awake again, and with the world come new guests. The inn's door opens. A farmer steps in, dragging a sack of something, possibly vegetable. Behind him, a woman with a travel cloak, and the polite smile of someone about to complain about prices, and naturally a knight with a dented helmet and no indoor voice. They look around, nods, are exchanged coins, change hands, questions are asked, answers are vague. The cycle begins again. The innkeeper takes a sip, Marjorie re-t-shirt apron, a chair is righted, a mug is filled, a stranger sits down and immediately asks if there's a vegan option. The end doesn't change much, these two stays. Mysterious, the guests remain unpredictable, the dope one suspects. Has a spare key, and yet despite the noise, the mess, and the deeply suspicious smells, they always come back. Maybe it's the warmth, the company, the chaos, or maybe, just maybe, it's the only place in town where your mistakes get swept up with the crumbs. And nobody asks questions before breakfast in the early 1600s. The Dutch Republic was about the size of a pancake, just as flat, but don't let geography fool you. This modest patch of reclaimed swamp was about to punch far above its weight, while the rest of Europe was busy stabbing each other over religion, and Woe's king had the shinier boots. The Dutch quietly built an empire of light money and oil paint. It started with a revolution. Spain had been bossing the Netherlands around for decades, waving the Catholic flag and squeezing taxes out of every fish and tulip bulb. But by 1648, after nearly 80 years of kicking and screaming, the Dutch finally declared, "We're done." And just like that, they were free. What followed was less of a national plan and more of an entrepreneurial free-for-all. Imagine Silicon Valley, but everyone wears wooden shoes and invests in herring. Amsterdam became the Wall Street of Europe. Its ports were crowded with ships headed to Asia, Africa, the Americas, anywhere with goods to trade or people to exploit. The Dutch East India Company, basically the Amazon Prime of the 17th century, made fortunes off nutmeg, porcelain, and let's not forget colonization. But the real twist, while their ships were hauling cinnamon across oceans back home, people were reading Vespers, sipping beer, and watching their neighbors get immortalized in oil by guys named Rembrandt and Vermeer's. Painters didn't just make portraits, they made legends. Vermeer captured quiet entertainments lit like divine cinema. Rembrandt gave old men and biblical figures more drama than a reality show. Art wasn't just for kings anymore. Merchants wanted portraits too, even butchers could afford a nice still life with a pig's head and almond tasteful. And then there were the tulips. Oh yes, the infamous tulip mania, a brief but spectacular episode where people sold entire houses just to own a flower bulb. One bulb, the market crashed harder than a drunk sailor, but by then the Dutch had already established their reputation, wildly successful, slightly unhinged, and never boring. So, how did a tiny damp republic become the envy of Europe? By mastering C, the stock market, and the self-portrait. And this was just the beginning. If the Dutch Golden Age had a beating heart, it wasn't in a palace or a parliament. It was in the docks, Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Hoorn, Delft. These weren't just cities. They were launchpads for global domination with sails and spreadsheets. While France was polishing its wigs and Spain was still counting its gold, the Dutch were busy inventing capitalism one logbook at a time. Their secret weapon, the merchant fleet at its peak. The Dutch had more ships than any other nation on earth, more than England, more than Spain, possibly more than common sense should allow. But these weren't just fishing boats with attitude. These were armored merchant ships, sleek and practical, loaded with cannon and cargo space. They carried everything: silk from China, spices from Indonesia, sugar from Brazil, occasionally a cannonball to the face if pirates showed up. The Dutch East India Company, also known by its terrifying acronym VOC, was the world's first multinational corporation. Charters, stock markets, dividends. Yes, it was capitalism before it was cool or even ethical. The VOC did whatever it took to protect profit fortresses of armies, and let's not sugarcoat it. Some rather ruthless colonial tactics. The spice trade wasn't just cutthroat, it was decapitation friendly, and while the VOC was ruling the East, the West India company was handling things in the Atlantic. Think sugar room and slavery, the Dutch. Involvement in the transatlantic slave trade was not just incidental, it was systemic, calculated, and profitable. The same country commissioning paintings of milkmaids was also trading human lives on a ledger. The Golden Age had a deeply tarnished underd. Yet amid this brutal efficiency, the Dutch also brought a kind of order to global trade. Their ships sailed on set routes, their cargoes were catalogued, their ports were clean, secure, and shockingly well insured. If there was ever a nation that could ship tulips, cheese, and gunpowder in the same boat without confusing the labels, it was the Dutch. They weren't just navigating oceans, they were navigating economics. While other countries sent explorers, the Dutch sent accountants with muskets as their empire wasn't just built with swords, it was built with balance sheets. And somehow, amid the maritime hustle, their little republic kept thriving. Next, we zoom into the velvet-lit world of Weimar, where everyday life became eternal. Wow. Dutch ships hauled goods across continents, and trading companies turned quarterly profits into golden chandeliers. Something else was happening quietly, almost silently, in the towns and inns of the Dutch Republic. A girl poured milk. A woman laced her pearls. A letter was read in silence beside an open window, and with every mundane moment, a man named Johannes Vermeer turned ordinary life into eternal poetry. Vermeer wasn't the most famous painter of his day. In fact, he wasn't even the busiest. He produced a grand total of about 35 known works. That's less than what Rembrandt spilled on the floor during a single bad week. But what Weimar lacked in volume, he made up for in radiance. His paintings are calm, composite, and eerily luminous, like someone painted sunlight holding its breath. What set him apart? Precision, detail, and a near mystical understanding. Light, the interiors he painted weren't just backgrounds, they were characters. You could almost hear the creak of the wooden floors and the ticking of a clock. And that's the secret of the Dutch Golden Age. While the outside world raced forward, artists like a Vermeer captured the sacredness of slowness. Of course, Vermeer's magic wasn't performed in a vacuum. This was a society that adored images. The average Dutch home in the 17th century had more paintings on the walls than forks in the kitchen drawer. Landscapes, portraits, still lives, ships, cows, and a generous number of dead fish arranged on tables. They loved it all. Why? Because this was a Middle-East country. Merchants, bakers, and brewers had money and taste. They didn't want cherubs floating in clouds. They wanted something that looked like their world, but slightly better lit. And the painter's style of Dutch art became an industry, fast, detailed, and refreshingly local. But back to Vermeer, his works weren't flashy or political. They didn't shout, they whispered, and in those whispers were volumes about intimacy, solitude, and the quiet drama of domestic life. He painted what was often overlooked and made it unforgettable. In the next chapter, we'll step out of these golden lit rooms and into the streets of a booming Republic, because outside Vermeer's windows an economic experiment was brewing that will both dazzle and implode. The infamous tulip mania picture. This: you walk into a pub in 1636, you're just a regular Dutch citizen, maybe a baker or a cheese merchant. A man next to you offers to sell you a tulip bulb, not a bouquet, just one bulb. The price the same as your house, and the crazy part, you consider it. Welcome to tulip mania, the fever dream of early capitalism, and possibly the world's first recorded financial bubble. The Dutch didn't invent flowers, of course, but they perfected the art of monetizing them. Tulips, especially the rare striped varieties caused by a virus that oddly made them more desirable, became status symbols. Owning a unique tulip bulb was like driving a Ferrari today, except you had to dig it out of the dirt and hope no one accidentally soup out of it. At first, it was just wealthy collectors dabbling, but soon a very unwanted. And farmers, barbers, chimney sweeps, if you could hold a coin in, had a pulse, you were speculating in tulips. Entire savings were spent. Futurist contracts were created. People traded rights to bulbs that hadn't even bloomed. Yet it wasn't about flowers. Anymore, it was about flipping a promise before the petal ever showed for a brief. Dazzling momentulips were the Bitcoin of the 17th century, then came the Kirschone. February day in 1637, people stopped buying, maybe they blinked and realized that they were mortgaging homes for plants. Maybe someone actually saw a tulip and thought, wait, that's it. Prices collapsed, fortunes vanished, and suddenly, that one bulb you paid the price of a Connell house for worthless, you might as well plant it and try to enjoy the views. Strangely enough, Dutch economy didn't fully collapse with the tulip market. It was embarrassing, yes. There were lost wits. There were public sermons about greed and vanity, but the Republic shrugged, dusted off its doublets, and moved on. It wasn't their last brush with speculative mania, just the prettiest one, Tulip Mania Becca Memorial. Tale about hubris, irrational markets, and the humanity to chase beauty until it bites. But while the bulbs rotted, the Dutch spirit didn't, because just around the corner, the Republic was building a cultural imperium, books, maps, and ideas, and that's where we head next, while tulips were being traded like gold, and Weimar was busy painting women doing very quiet things near window. Something else was quietly blossoming in the Dutch Republic. The mind. The Dutch didn't just ship goods, they shipped ideas. In the 17th century, that was dangerous business. Let's start with printing presses at a time when publishing the wrong opinion and say, Spain could get innately burned at the stake. The Netherlands became a haven for writers, philosophers, and rebels with quills. The Dutch had a relatively illiterate attitude toward free thought, at least as long as it didn't mess with trade, which meant books flowed out of Amsterdam like wine at a merchant banquet. Ideas banned elsewhere found safe harbor here. Descartes wrote and published in the Netherlands. Baruch Spinoza, the excommunicated Jewish philosopher who suggested that maybe God wasn't an old man in the sky, but something more like reality itself, lived and thought here in relative peace until he became too radical. Even for the radicals, universities like Leiden and Utter became intellectual magnets. Students from across Europe came to study everything from law and medicine to the latest theories in optics and anatomy. And because this was the Dutch, they studied in buildings clean enough to eat off and catalog their knowledge with terrifying precision. Crafty also thrived. Dutch mapmakers like John Bliel were not just sketching coastlines, they were redrawing the European imagination. Their ateliers were masterpieces, decorative, wildly inaccurate in parts, but astonishingly detailed for their time. Want to explore the coast of Java or dream about Brazil? Just open a Dutch map. This intellectual curiosity wasn't limited to scholars. The middle class read audaciously pamphlets, travalic scientific treatises, and scandalous poetry. Newspapers circulated stories from Constantinople to the New World. For the first time in European history, literacy wasn't a luxury, it was a lifestyle, but it wasn't enlightenment and espresso. These ideas stirred the pot. Religious tensions simmered. Philosophers were censored. Some books were quietly banned. The Dutch tolerated a lot, but even tolerance has its limits when profits start messing with property laws. Still, for a republic of just a few million people, the Dutch punched far above their weight in shaping modern thought and speaking. Off-shaping next, we turn to the architectural boom that transformed their cities into Baroque Lego sets. Off-brick canals and proud gables. Imagine a city built like a painting, straight lines, soft curves, and everything in its proper place. Even the ducks. That was Amsterdam. In the 17th century, a masterpiece of urban design brought to life by engineers, merchants, and a stubborn refusal to let water win. The Dutch didn't just build cities, they drained them into existence. Much of the land the Republic stood on was technically underwater or had been recently persuaded not to be. With dikes, pumps, and sheer willpower, the Dutch reshaped their world. Where other nations saw swamp, they saw potential real estate at the heart of this watery miracle. Was the canal ring of Amsterdam, known as the Graftengordel. It was elegant, efficient, and about as close As urban planning gets to poetry-concentric canals, carve it they city into districts, goods moved by boat, not cart-rich merchants. Built narrow houses with steep steps and grand windows, showing off just enough wealth to impress, but not enough to look. French those tall houses with their ornate gables, they weren't just aesthetic choices, they were tax strategies. Property taxes were based on width, not height. So people built upward, not outward, squeezing luxury into vertical elegance, the resultant architectural skyline that looks like gingerbread real estate and smells faintly of Calvinist restraint brick was the material of choice. It was cheap, durable, and made the streets look like a Renaissance Minecraft server, but design wasn't only about beauty. The Dutch emphasized duality. Even their ornate facades had winches and pulleys to lift furniture up through windows, since spiral staircase inside were less stately and more claustrophobia simulator public buildings, also Bloomtown Hall's Ways Guild. Hall's the grandest of them all, Amsterdam's town hall finished in 1655. It was so magnificent that Louis XIV reportedly called it the eighth wonder of the world and promptly copied it, as was his habit, and amid all this architectural splendor, there was a message: the Dutch Republic wasn't about kings or cathedrals. It was about city citizens and civic pride, clean streets, tidy facades, order, and elegance. This was a built environment that reflected a national mindset, precise, practical, and quietly proud, but beneath this order, tensions simmered, political divisions, religious strife, and international rivals were gathering. In the next chapter, we dive into the conflicts internal and external that would test the very seams of this golden republic for all its brilliance. The Dutch Golden Age wasn't some utopia of harmony and polite cheese tasting behind the tulips and oil paintings. Lay a republic built in tension, political, religious, and increasingly military. First, the politics. The Dutch Republic wasn't really a republic in the modern sense. It was a jigsaw puzzle of provinces, each jealously guarding its rights, like a toddler hoarding snacks. The real power lay with the wealthy merchant class in cities like Amsterdam and Leiden. These men weren't nobles, but they had the money to pretend. At the top of the political pyramid was the stadtholder, usually from House of Orange, a military leader with just enough power to make everyone nervous think of him as a monarch without a disclaimer. Some provinces liked him, others liked him less. The result, a constant tug-of-war between centralized leadership and provincial independence. A sort of political group project where half the group wants to fire the leader and the other half is the leaders. Cousin religiously, the Dutch had technically broken with Catholicism, but that didn't mean unity. The Calvinists were in charge, and they weren't exactly famous for their open-mindedness. Other Protestants, Jews, and Catholics were tolerated, as long as they didn't cause a fuss, build big churches, or throw parades publicly. Everything was orderly privately. It was tense internationally. The Dutch were suddenly a major power, and the old guard didn't like that. The English, once their Protestant pals, saw them as economic rivals. Cue the Anglo-Dutch Wars, a series of naval brawls where both sides lost ship's pride and occasionally their tempers. The Dutch held their own thanks to admirals like Michel de Ruyter, who was equal parts pirate strategist and national hero. He once sailed up the Thames and stole the English flagship for fun, but warfare is expensive, maintaining fleets, defending trade routes, and ribbing neighbors. Not to attack all this added strain to a delicate system, and while the Dutch could juggle commerce, culture, and colonies, they couldn't juggle forever. The cracks in the Golden Age had begun to show, not in the art or the architecture, but in the very system that built it next. We'll visit the twilight of this era and ask, how does a golden age end? With a crash, a war, or simply ion from history? Golden ages don't typically end with explosions. More often they fade quietly, awkwardly, like a party where the best guests have already left and someone just knocked over the wine. The Dutch Republic in the late 1600s wasn't collapsing, it was sighing. The signs were subtle at first. Trade remained strong, but competitors We're catching up the English and French, we're getting better at naval warfare, and even better at copying. Dutch business models, the English created their own East India Company, threw in some colonial ambition, and added the one thing the Dutch didn't have: a monarchy with a flair for self-promotion. Meanwhile, France under Louis XIV had grown aggressive. Very aggressive. He wasn't content with verses and fancy shoes. He wanted borders, power, and maybe a few Dutch cities. While Hugh was at it, the resulting wars were brutal and expensive. The Dutch won a few, lost a few more, and bled money throughout domestically. The Republic had another problem: boredom. Innovation slowed painters, stopped painting radical new ideas, and started repeating what sold: rows of cowships and sleepy windmills. Art became safe, banking became cautious. The canal houses were still pretty, but the energy had shifted. You could feel the flicker in the oil lamp. There were deeper fractures too. The divide between the House of Orange and the Republican regents deepened. The middle class, once the engine of prosperity, began to stagnate. Tensions brewed between old money and new ambition, and most importantly, young Dutch. People stopped believing they were the center of the world because they weren't anymore. The final blow came not as a single disaster, but as a shift in when the age of enlightenment was dawning elsewhere. Britain took the crown as the world's financial and naval superpower. France stole the stage in art and science until the guillotine got involved, and the Dutch, once the marvel of Europe, found themselves quietly edged. Greece, everything was political, including who could throw a discus the farthest. The games offered the perfect opportunity for the often fractured Greek city-states, the Palatii, to meet, compete, and engage in the ancient equivalent of international PR. Athens might build temples and Sparta might train soldiers, but Olympia, that's where they showcased national identity. Winning an event didn't just glorify the athlete, it glorified the polis. He came from. One man's victory was a billboard for his hometown superiority. City-states even funded and trained athletes as a matter of prestige. These weren't amateurs jogging. Greek men, not slaves, not foreigners, not even women. The Olympics were a showcase of Greek masculinity in all its oiled-up glory. Competitors came from city-states across the Greek world: Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Rhodes, and beyond, but only if they could prove their Hellenic bloodline. Citizenship was more than paperwork, it was a birthright, and without it you weren't setting foot on that track. And then there was the nudity. Accompanying nude was standard. Why? For one, the Greeks believed the human body, particularly the male body, was the physical expression of divine perfection. Also, it made cheating harder. No secret weapons, no armor, and no hiding behind flashy gear, just you, your muscles, and maybe a very unfortunate sunburn. Training wasn't optional. Athletes had to prove they'd been preparing for 10 months prior and undergo a final month off supervised training at Olympia itself. This wasn't a casual pastime, it was a brutal regimen of running, grappling, and tossing heavy things until you resembled a marble statue, minus the helpful plinth. No. About women, they were banned from competing, and in most cases from even watching. A married woman caught attending could be thrown off. Mount Tabion. Exceptions were made only for unmarried women, particularly priestesses like the priestess of Deita, who had front row seats as part of her religious office. But don't worry, women had their own games, the Heron Games, honoring the goddess Hera, with foot races for Gian from the olive grove. They were finely tuned instruments of civic propaganda. Victories were immortalized in poem statues and in elaborate public ceremonies. Enter cities would give free meals for life to Olympic victors because nothing says you represent our greatness like unlimited wine and lamb chops. But the Olympics weren't just for flexing muscles, they were for flexing alliance. Political leaders used the games as a diplomatic platform. Treaties were discussed, marriages were negotiated, even military campaigns were timed around the sacred truce that accompanied the games. Oh, yes, the Olympic truce, or Echirithis, was a formal agreement that all Greek states would cease hostilities during the games, so athletes and spectators could travel safely to Olympia. In theory, it was a moment of pan-Hellenic peace. In reality, It was more of a polite suggestion. Some wars did pause, others simply ignored. The memo Sparta naturally is banned from the games at least once for being too war-happy. Monuments and dedications at Olympia were also politically charged. Cities that won battles or gained wealth often built treasuries or statues to flaunt their success. The sanctuary became a kind of ancient leaderboard, a literal arms race in marble. Even cheating had political consequences if an athlete was caught bribing an opponent or falsifying citizenship. Their city's reputations furred, and in the high-stakes world of Greek rivalry, that was nearly as bad as losing a war. Becoming an Olympic athlete in ancient Greece wasn't a matter of signing up and hoping for the best. It was a brutal, lifelong commitment. Equal parts devotion, self-denial, and a surprising amount of sand in your undercarriage. You didn't just show up at Olympia ready to run, you had to prove it, and before you even got close to the track, you were expected to survive months of punishing preparation. Athletes trained at the gymnasium, a Greek institution that was part fitness center, part temple, and part philosophy class. The word gymnasium literally means place to be naked, which tells you most of what you need to know. Training was conducted in the nude, not for shock value, but because the Greeks believed in celebrating the human form as a vessel of divine strength. Each city had its own gymnasia, but serious Olympic hopefuls traveled to Elis, the city that administered the games there, under the watchful eyes of officials and trainers. They endured a mandatory 30-day trial before the Olympics. No distractions, no wine, no excuses, just relentless exercise and a diet that would make modern athletes wheat, barley bread, figs, cheese, and lots of olive oil rubbed on the body, not eaten. The trainers, called patribus, weren't gentle. They pushed their athletes through wrestling drills, sprinting routines, javelin throws, and strength exercises. The Greeks had no patience for slackers. If you couldn't keep up, you were out, and they meant it. Judges actually disqualified contestants for the games. Even started if they didn't meet the physical standard. Discipline was everything. No gym memberships, no protein shakes, no fans cheering you on from Instagram, just they grinned. Ancient athletes endured punishing heat, strict diets, and grueling repression, all for a fleeting moment of glory and maybe a lifetime of free meals if they won. And it wasn't just about the body. The ideal athlete was expected to have the sound mind. Two gymnasia were also places of learning where future champions discussed philosophy, ethics, and the meaning of arte. Excellence in all things. To compete in Olympia was to pursue perfection. Not just victory, not just strength, but to become something closer to the gods. The sun rises over Olympia. The air is thick with incense, sweat, and anticipation for 5 days. The sacred sanctuary becomes the epicenter of the Greek world. Pilgrims, poets, merchants, politicians, and pickpocket soul converge for the spectacle. Today is not a normal day today. The gods are watching. The opening procession is a blend of ceremony and flexing. Athletes stripped bare and shining with olive oil march in a arena. Spectators cheer, city-states wave banners, and judges called the Hellenode look on with expressions that say, "We will disqualify you for blinking funny." The crowd is massive. Tens of thousands cram into the stadium, sitting on stone-ordered embankments, shaded only by the occasional olive tree and a well-placed sun hat. There are no tickets, no assigned seats, and no bathrooms. Worth mentioning what there is, however, is noise, lots of it. Shouts of support, jeers at rivals, vendors hawking wine and honey cakes, and philosophers grumbling about the decline of morals. Then the trumpet blare. The events begin. Runners launch from their marks with no starting pistol, just a loud shout, and the tension of 1,000 ice wrestlers grapple in the sand, slipping in the oil and kicking up. Dust chariots race dangerously around hairpin turns in the hippodromium, where crashes are frequent and occasionally fatal. And deep in creation, that's where things get downright primal, choking, twisting, punching. All in front of Zeus. Winners are crowned immediately after their events with an olive wreath from the sacred tree of Olympia. No medals, no podiums, just a loop of Branches and there are of the crowd, but the glory eternal victors are celebrated. Like war heroes back home, their names are etched in stone, their likeness carved in marbling. If they're lucky, a poet like Pender will immortalize their deeds in verse alone. Dramatic and extremely flattering verse, and through it all the divine presents lingers. Offerings are made, bulls are sacrificed the gods. Are rethanked because every leap, throw, and sprint isn't just for fame, it's an offering, a prayer made with muscle and grit. The games are over, the dust settles, the crowds pack up their amori and head home, but for a select few, those crowned with an olive wreath, life is never the same again in ancient Greece. Olympic victory wasn't just an athletic achievement, it was a full-blown life upgrade. Winning an Olympia meant you didn't just beat other men. You had pleased the gods, and that kind of divine favor came with serious perks. Victors returned to their pall as heroes' statues were raised, and their honor poets sang their praises in verses so flowery they could outshine the guerdons of Aphrodite. Some cities gave their champions front row seats at public events. Others offered free meals for life, a far better prize than a medal, especially in a world where dinner wasn't guaranteed. Wealthy patrons lined up to sponsor you families, arrange better marriage prospects. Children were taught your name in school, and if you were from a small town, you might find your face carved on local coinage, your apes immortalized in bronze, but with fame came expectation. Olympic victors weren't allowed to vanish into obscurity. They became symbols, living proof of a city's greatness. Some were sent on diplomatic missions, others recruited as generals. Their bodies had earned glory, and now their names had to carry it. Of course, not everyone handled the spotlight. While some athletes grew arrogant, one famously tried to dedicate a statue to himself and the gods only for the people to quietly change the inscription. Others tried to cheat in later games, thinking their reputation will protect them. Spoiler: it didn't. Those caught bribing opponents or lying about their citizenship were fined, humiliated, and sometimes had their names wiped from records. But for the honest few, the reward was Klaus' immortal fame. In Greek culture, Klaus was the golden ticket, the chance to be remembered not just by your children or your city, but by history itself. If you outed young, your name lived on. If you lived long, you became a mentor, a legend, maybe even a myth. And that's what made the Olympic Games more than sport. They were a forge for legacy for over 1,000 years. The Olympic Games blazed like a sacred flame, held every 4 years without fail, even through wars and plagues. From 776 B.C.